What is going on, guys? Welcome back to another episode of Kerbal Space Program, and we actually start in space because, in case you missed last week's video, this is part 2 of my multi-launch expedition to Gilly and Eve. Last week, we constructed this interplanetary mothership in low Kerbin orbit, and this week we're going to take it to Eve, land on Eve, go to Gilly, do all the other stuff that was promised last episode. So you can see I'm already at a point where I'm at a good Eve transfer window, which is when Eve is about 55 degrees behind Kerbin. By that I mean if you were to draw a line from Kerbin to the sun to Eve, the angle it forms at the sun should be about 55 degrees, and once you've got that, you have it should be fairly easy to get an encounter. If you can't get a dead-on encounter with Eve, you can probably do some interplanetary burns once you're in deeper space around the sun, just to do some minor adjustments to your orbital inclination. But in this case, we did not need to. We could just go ahead and time warp round to the burn itself, which is going to be just the one burn. And we've only got 5 nuclear engines to power us. And we have a fairly high dry mass, so it's going to be a very long burn. That's why we're starting with a fairly high periapsis. When we're doing big burns like this, I try and keep our periapsis, or our apoapsis around Kerbin, to be around 90 kilometers, just to ensure that we definitely won't be dipping below the atmospheric border, because as you can see, burning for such a long time like this really does force that periapsis height down. But by having that apoapsis height of 90 kilometers, we were safe. Just playing the footage back fairly quickly now. At the time, the reason I'm doing one burn rather than splitting it across multiple passes in order to not only maximize the O-berth effect, but also ensuring that we're not going to be risking dipping our periapsis too low, is because I wanted this video to try and not drag on too long. At the time, I didn't realize that I was going to be doing 2 videos anyway, but even so, this video itself is still pretty long, so any kind of time-saving maneuver I can do, I will do. And this is not an SSTO mission or anything that's going for any kind of level of efficiency. With rockets and stuff, I'm more than happy to just build on extra stages and extra fuel tanks in order to minimize the amount of orbital maneuvers and just general time spent in space whenever I can. So that was another sort of reasoning for that. So we've got our Eve encounter, but it wasn't a perfect one. We can do some minor adjustments in interplanetary space, like I said before. Even if you can't get the Eve encounter itself, you can do kind of the last bit of the adjustments here. Obviously, it will probably cost you a little bit more than what I've got, which is about 75, just under meters per second in order to do our inclination change. But, I'm pretty happy with that. So yeah, we're going to, I guess, point towards the maneuver node and get ready to perform this burn. Now, this ship does have a lot of delta V in that nuclear stage. One of the reasons for this is because, and I would recommend you do this as well, we're not going to be trying to do an aero capture around Eve. A lot of people, myself included, granted, when you go to things like Juna and even places like Lathe, it's often quite a popular thing to do an aero brake around the planet or moon or whatever to save fuel. However, Eve's atmosphere is very, very deadly. I would not recommend doing aero brakes unless you, plan on just doing a one-way mission. So you don't have to worry about preserving any engines when you finish your aero brake and are happy to just land straight on the surface. But even then, interplanetary speeds are very, very fast for Eve. I would always advocate doing some level of initial capture using engines just to slow down your entry speed into Eve's atmosphere, because it is very, very easy to overheat. So I generally say always try and do your circularization around Eve using engines. It really doesn't take that much because its orbit is so similar to Kerbin's orbit that your relative speed is not that high when you enter Eve's sphere of influence, so it shouldn't cost you too much. You've already done the hard part of building a ship that can actually get off the surface of Eve. Adding that little bit of extra power just to perform a circularization with engines shouldn't be too much to ask for. Now here we are, circularizing at Eve. We are well underway with our initial burn. We're going to do 2 burns to get our apoapsis slightly lowered, but I am still going to leave this ship in a fairly eccentric orbit for a couple of reasons. Firstly, the lander stage itself can lower its orbit using repeated aero brakes. We're now going sufficiently slow enough that the heat shields will adequately protect it from any effect of deadly atmospheric entry. And that means that we can then lower the apoapsis of the transfer stage without that big heavy lander on top, saving us a lot of fuel. By lowering the apoapsis and slowing down the orbit of this ship in those 2 stages, we'll end up saving some delta V. Granted, we do have excessive delta V in that transfer stage, but, doing it this way does have another benefit, which means that whilst we are doing all of our surface activities, I'm going to just leave the mothership in the eccentric orbit. So when it comes to redocking with the Ascension module, if the Ascension module's orbit doesn't match the transfer stage's orbit at all, it will be very easy to do inclination adjustments, because the further away you are from periapsis, the cheaper inclination adjustments are and the shorter the burns. It just makes it a lot easier to do rendezvous when you're not sure if you're going to be able to get into an appropriate orbit around Eve, which, as I've said before, we don't end up getting into. So it's just as well we did this. But to be honest, we are in our orbit now. And all things considered, I'd say it's pretty good. So I'm lowering my periapsis here in order to infiltrate Eve's atmosphere. Then we're going to undock we're going to undock the lander once we've boarded our Kerbals onto it. I know we could transfer them directly through the UI, but it feels a bit more, realistic, a bit less cheesy to EVA them round like this rather than, transfer them through several stages of fuel tanks and engines. There we are, Jebediah and Bob, I think it is, safely aboard the Ascension stage. We can quickly take the mothership now and get it back into a stable orbit so it itself does not enter the atmosphere. The fuel tank we've left above, I made sure all the fuel was pumped out of that and into this stage here, so we've got as much fuel as we can, and that the fuel tank that's going to get destroyed is hopefully an empty fuel tank. There we are, so we can detach that now and get ready to enter the atmosphere. So we can deploy their big heat shields and make sure we're pointing periapsis and retrograde, sorry. What did I say, periapsis? And here we go. So I did cover this during the build episode last week, but in case anyone missed it or just decided they didn't want to watch the build, we've got 2 sets of heat shields there, but we only really need one of them. The bottom one is the one that shields this thing from the heat, but the top one acts as a sort of drogue chute. If we didn't have that top one there, this thing would pretty much flip immediately because of the kind of skewed center of gravity. It would not be very stable. But by having that top heat shield there, it just makes sure that our aerodynamic profile remains fairly balanced, and it means that we won't flip quite so easily. Another thing we have on this ship that I did cover last episode, but in case you didn't watch it, I'm going to go over it again. One thing we didn't need we got some engines there on some unfolding girders. You can kind of see them just towards the end. That's kind of where the temperature gauge is now, actually, that cluster of engines there. Those are deorbiting engines. At the time, I wasn't sure whereabouts we'd be landing because I'm using a lot of visual mods that obscure Eve's surface, so I wasn't sure what kind of biome we'd be landing in. So I decided to just go ahead and YOLO it, and if it transpired that we were landing in the water, which this thing can't land in, we could just revert to a point where we hadn't quite decayed our orbit enough to enter the atmosphere without being able to resurface, and we could just modify the orbit by either speeding up or slowing down, thereby raising or lowering our periapsis respectively, in order to try and modify where we ended up landing. But, like I said, we didn't end up needing them, but I guess they're there in case you yourself do. Now, I'm leaving the bottom shield deployed here just because it serves as a nice way of keeping ourselves nice and slow in the upper atmosphere before our chutes fully deploy. Until the parachutes fully deploy, you do end up falling quite fast through Eve's atmosphere, and sometimes you end up going sufficiently fast that the parachutes start shredding due to the atmospheric forces, which is not something you want, so I'd recommend keeping the lower shield attached at least until all of the parachutes are deployed. The other major advantage of this being heat shields generate a lot of drag, they fall very slowly, so if you're not falling very slowly because all your parachutes haven't deployed, there's a good chance the heat shield will just slam and start clipping upwards towards your engines because it'll be falling at a slower speed than you are. You don't want that, it causes lots of glitches, Kraken attacks. Just wait till your parachutes are deployed before you detach it. But there we are, all landed. I deployed the girder structure that kept the top shield attached, I should say. And now we can do a dramatic zoom in and showcase the very reason that I'm even doing that. I don't think I've even mentioned why I'm doing this video. It was because Eve and Gilly have received facelifts in the latest Kerbal Space Program update. And look at that surface now. My goodness, well, thanks Squad for making all of my previous Eve videos completely outdated, including Expedition Eve. Now I'm gonna have to remake Expedition Eve with these new graphics because they really do look staggeringly beautiful. That being said, there are some flashy, glitchy things going on the surface, which is not there's not a problem with the update, it's a problem with my visual mod, so I will fix that in a second. So excuse the stuttering, flashy ground, that will get fixed in just a second. For now, we can get our Kerbals on EVA and deploy the rover because, I wanted to really maximize the amount of stuff we could do on the surface of Eve to make the most of our time on this brand new surface. So I brought a rover along with us. We could do some science courtesy of the new breaking ground parts. We've got a robot arm with us to do some scanning. So now you may have noticed the sky doesn't look quite so good because I've uninstalled all my visual mods, but at least the ground looks less epileptic seizure inducing. So I would call that a win. Now, this rover is attached to the service bay using the front docking port, so I kind of did abuse the offset tool a bit, but I think this is a fairly unegregious use of that. The reason I wanted the docking port on the front of the rover is because we can make it, we can set that as the control point for the rover, so I don't think it'll make a huge difference, but the Kerbal seats are slightly offset, obviously to the left and to the right. Ideally, we'd like to be able to control the rover from the center if we can. So you can just right-click the docking port and click control from here. And now make sure you're controlling from the center of the rover. That's why I've got that piece there. But yeah, we can get our Kerbals on board and start thinking about doing some field science. So we've got mystery goo. We've got all the science units, basically, aside from the gravioli and the atmospheric scanner and the red thing, the ground analyzer. I really should, as a quote-unquote professional KSP player, I should probably learn the names of these pieces, but... Oh, look at that. I've lost my train of thought because isn't that a beautiful sight? Those rovers having fun. Those Kerbals having fun on their rover exploring. So I'm just looking for a piece of rock we can analyze. I spied this boulder in the distance, but I suspected this was just a normal rock that wasn't added with the breaking ground part. The way you can tell is if you can drive through it. Yes, we can. It doesn't have any solid mass. It's not a solid entity. We can't scan it. But this one, looks more like the part. So I pulled up next to it, and sure enough, our scanning arm recognized it as a scannable feature, and it can therefore be deployed and start performing some scientific analysis. There we are. Look at that. Isn't that beautiful? And there we are. Volcanic rock analysis. There we are. Volcanic rock. What could this teach us about Eve? Maybe I should have read the science report and I could tell you, but... Time is of the essence. We're nearly 12 minutes into this video and we still haven't done one of the whole landings that we need to do, and we're still stuck on Eve, which is a situation I believe many players are familiar with, but it's not something I intend to, stick around with too long. We need to get back to the rocket and get ready to, leave this terrible place. I will say right now that we do accidentally leave all of the science data stuck on board the lander once we re-embark the mothership, so I don't actually get any science from this mission, but I do have a fully unlocked tech tree, so it's not too much of an issue. So there we can go back to the rocket and pull up alongside it, get ready to re-embark our crew modules. Oh, nothing to see here, ladies and gentlemen, just Jebediah just testing out the ability for this thing to self-right, and as you can see, it was a very successful test. I totes meant to do that, yo. And now the SAS started glitching out a bit, so I just folded in the wheels, deployed them, and then the thing started moving forward again, even when I turned on the brakes. So I wasn't quite sure. Oh, yeah, see, it's moving forward even though the brakes are deployed. So I think something sort of glitched out at this point. So I think I'm still trying to fix the issue here of having it, stop with the brakes turned on, but I guess the motor might have glitched out. Maybe by quick saving and quick loading I could have fixed it, but I'm using the Making History wheels. I believe they're from the Making History pack anyway, and they can be folded up. So that was my, guerrilla solution to fixing the issues. Now we can just get Jebediah on board the pilot seat. He couldn't quite reach the pilot module on that ladder, so I had to just get him into the capsule below it, which is inside that fairing, and then transferred him into the upper cockpit, and then we can go ahead and get him on board as well. Obviously, we brought him because he's a scientist, and since we're doing lots of scientific analysis, makes sense to bring a scientist. He can quickly deploy the flag, which Jebediah neglected to plant. Come on, Jebediah, it's the most important part of the mission, and there's a potential thumbnail shot if I do say so myself. Not quite sure what the thumbnail's going to be yet. Maybe it'll be that. Get him up the ladder as well, and there's not much more to comment on, really. I just went through all this when Jebediah got on board the ship. So, epic crossfade across. I'm going to launch on the light side of the planet just because it looks more aesthetically pleasing for a video, but it means that we're going to be ending up in an orbit that does not correlate to our mothership's orbit whatsoever. So that's what I was talking about earlier when I said our orbit is not going to be anywhere near appropriate for docking with the mothership. That's why I wanted to launch from the light side of the planet, just because, as I've said before ad nauseum, that YouTube's algorithm makes videos darker anyway, and Kerbal nights are dark. I'd rather minimize the amount of darkness in my videos whenever I can. And there we are, taking off. So we've got 2 aero spikes and a vector engine firing. The aero spikes are only here to supplement the first stage. They'll be deploying with the first set of fuel tanks, which will be very, very quick. This thing is an asparagus setup, so those fuel tanks are going to drain very, very fast. I'm going to be basically going straight up whilst we've got those aero spikes, because we need to punch through the thickest layer of the atmosphere, and this is the most difficult part of the ascent in terms of, power required. So we want to basically just maximize the amount of altitude we can gain whilst we've got as many boosters as we can. That's why I went straight up initially. I'm playing the footage back at real-time speed, by the way, just so you can get a sense of kind of how I'm doing this flight. Now we can just start to very gradually start tipping over, making sure, of course, that we right-click the fuel tanks in sequence, because there's not going to be any engine flame outs to indicate when those tanks are done. So we need to just manually watch those fuel lines. I'm trying to stick as close as I can to the prograde marker, but I also don't want to tip over too soon, because Eve's atmosphere is so thick. Even, now we're passing the 10 kilometer mark, it's still very, very thick. We'd start burning up too fast if we were to accelerate at maximum speed on a 45-degree trajectory. So we're going to just very gradually tip over, trying to keep our speed fairly low. Now watch what happens when we deploy these tanks and watch what our speed does. See, now we deploy those tanks, we're just basically a pencil shape now, and our speed rapidly starts to increase as we not only punch towards the upper parts of the atmosphere where the air resistance is very thin, but also now that our aerodynamic profile has become much, much better, you can see our speed becomes very, very high. And we don't want to go too fast, like I said, because look at all those flames. We're in a very high risk of overheating and exploding. So we're keeping our thrust, look at that, our throttle is at a quarter speed at this point. Again, pointing about 45 degrees by this point, and just watching the temperature gauge on that nose cone. We don't want that to blow up, because that's just going to subject the main cockpit to a world of heat that it wasn't exposed to before. We don't really want to be doing that. So yeah, those temperature gauges are dying down now, and we can see the stars. We're barely throttling at all now, but now we're kind of clear of the dangerous parts of the atmosphere. We can start tipping ourselves forward to basically start raising our periapsis height, which is still pretty low. And there goes the vector stage, so we can ditch that and use the more efficient Terrier for the rest of our ascent. We're effectively in space, past 70 kilometers, which is the atmosphere is basically negligible at this point. So we're going to be piling all of our speed into building up horizontal velocity. So to help squeeze a little bit of extra delta V out of this thing, we can ditch the nose cone at the front because it's not needed anymore. We would also deploy the fairings that are shielding that lower command module. Create a maneuver node at apoapsis, take a look at the time required, and just start getting ready to perform that burn, which for most people will probably be now. You won't have much time to circularize at Eve if you're inefficient at your ascent like me. You can probably do better ascent if you really put your mind to it, but I always found that this profile works, so I just kind of do it. And yeah, we're just going to coast our way into an orbit, and then I can start worrying about how to get our mothership docked with our ascension module. The other reason I wanted to deploy that nose cone, by the way, was because it exposes the junior docking port, which we're going to be needing to dock to our mothership. We don't really need to dock to the mothership, but I've said before time and time again on my channel, I try and not leave debris in orbit whenever I can. So we deployed the nose cone whilst we were on a suborbital trajectory so that it crashed into the surface of Eve. Obviously, we can't leave the ascension module on a suborbital trajectory because we need to get the Kerbals onto the transfer stage. However, the transfer stage does have some junior docking ports on it, so we can dock with the ascension module, deorbit the ascension module, quickly get the transfer stage back into orbit, and just let the ascender, harmlessly deorbit into Eve. It'll probably burn up on re-entry. So here you can see we're just planning the maneuver to get ourselves docked with the ascension module, and as you can see, we're getting a pretty close separation there, half a kilometer. Ooh, kind of glitchy, but half a kilometer, I'll take that. So we could just go ahead and execute that maneuver node. I wasn't worried about being terribly accurate because oftentimes, in this case I got pretty close, but oftentimes, especially with longer burns, there can be a bit of a disparity between the maneuver node maker's prediction versus what actually happens when you execute that maneuver node. Just because the longer the burn, generally the greater that disparity. So I closed the maneuver node indicator at the last minute and just did the rest by eye, and we got a 0.2 kilometer separation. So pretty good. We can just time warp down, set our navball's relative speed, if it doesn't do it by default, to be the target. And I made a quick maneuver node there. You may have missed it, blink and you miss it, but I made a quick maneuver node to basically just see how long it would take to burn and put ourselves on an orbit that matches the target's orbit, and then close that. Just looked at our time to our target. Once our time to target was half the estimated burn time of that maneuver node I made, we can start our deceleration burn. Just the best way of doing things, I guess. And then we can just do the Lowne lazy method of approaching our target, which is just get nice and close, kill off all our relative speed with the retrograde marker, and then start burning towards it with the target indicator. Repeat again and again and again to get a 0 separation encounter. Not the most efficient way of docking, and it's certainly not a way I should probably be recommending, but if you've got excess delta V like me and you really just want to get things done, it's a pretty easy way of getting two things docked together in orbit. Now, when it comes to the docking itself, often what I do on this channel is make sure both ships are controllable, set the target for each ship to the other ship's docking port, and then keep them aligned using auto SAS, and they pretty easily dock together. However, that's only really true if the docking ports are on the ends of the ship, like how it is on the Ascension module. However, the docking port on the transfer stage is on the side. So we couldn't really do that. I mean, you technically could by right-clicking that docking port and pressing control from here on the transfer stage. But in my experience, it often tends to be quite glitchy and things will suddenly start spinning out of control. So I'm having to just be very careful here and just trying to do it manually. And as you can see, it worked out pretty well. So that's the reason why I didn't do my standard method of docking just here. Now that pink square is there again. And last week, I think I had it as well in the time week before. And I always said that it was a glitching of my visual mods. But obviously, I've now uninstalled my visual mods and it's still there. However, today, I was reading on the subreddit that apparently it's a glitch just with the update. You can fix it by just disabling and then re-enabling SAS, and that fixes it. Truth be told, I haven't actually tested this, so it could be wrong. But that's what I'm told is the fix. Now, what I'm doing here is I forgot to set up fuel priority or fuel lines or anything here. So I'm transferring all of the fuel from the peripheral tanks, which took a while, into the central core of this ship. The reason is I want to deorbit those peripheral 4 nuclear engines, and we want to be deorbiting them. I want to deorbit them. So I want to decouple them whilst I'm on a suborbital trajectory. So this is going to be my only shot to deorbit them, except for when, I don't know, we approach Gilly or Kerbin. But at that point, you know, we need to do an expensive burn to get to Gilly. I want to just ditch them now whilst there's no fuel left in them. So we're going to do a retrograde burn to put ourselves on a suborbital trajectory. And then we're going to detach the what remains of the Eve lander as well as those peripheral 4 nuclear engines. Because now all we're doing is hauling those 2 capsules at the top and the liquid fuel. We don't need the thrust to weight ratio that the 5 nuclear engines provided. We can detach all but one of them now for the rest of the mission. And obviously, you know, the excess, the dry mass, I should say, that we're ditching boosts our delta V quite exponentially. So yeah, now we've done that, we need to quickly point prograde and get ourselves get this ship on a stable orbit once again, so it itself does not deorbit. And there we are. That was the hardest part of this mission. The Gilly landing is all done. Now we need to go to the Gilly landing is all done. The Eve landing is all done. Now we need to do the easier part of this mission, which is the Gilly landing. And we actually got pretty lucky with our Gilly encounter. We got one pretty much immediately. If you can't get a Gilly encounter, I have done videos on how to get Gilly encounters. I did one really recently, actually. So I might link that in the description, or maybe I'll try sticking a card on screen. But basically what you do is you raise yourself into an eccentric orbit like I did, and then when you get to apoapsis, raise your periapsis to intersect Gilly's orbit. Again, not worrying too much about the target indicator nodes themselves. Make sure you just exactly cross Gilly's orbit. From there, create another maneuver node at the point where the orbits cross, and just drag on retrograde, and you'll see those grey indicator markers spin around, and you'll just get an encounter really easily. I know it's very hard for me to explain this without having a visual reference, so that's why I'm saying I would recommend checking out my low-tech. I've done 2 low-tech to Gilly videos, and I did a Gilly SSTO video as well, and I'm sure I've done other Gilly missions in the past. So I'd recommend just checking those out if you'd like more specific nuances on how to land on Gilly. Now, I didn't do a great job with executing that burn. I overshot it a bit, and I couldn't quite get a very good encounter. So I do a quick retrograde burn just to lower our apoapsis, because the problem was Gilly was always ending up ahead of us. So if we lower our orbital height slightly, it means we'll get there a bit sooner. And as you can see, we can now more easily get a Gilly encounter. I say, there we go. You don't have to worry about getting anything too special, to be honest. You just get one and you should be fine. And then we can just time up around and execute that burn. And there's a lovely shot of Eve. Obviously, now I've not got my visual mods. I get to see it without the clouds on, which is a novelty for me, actually. I'm so used to having clouds enabled, I very rarely get to see Eve's surface, so isn't that nice? I guess every cloud has a silver lining. How was that for a definitely planned pun? So I didn't get there we go. There's our target encounter all done. I'm doing a little bit of fine-tuning just to make sure our periapsis isn't too far away from the surface of Gilly like it is there. There we go. Just did a quick inclination change just to make sure we're getting closer, because it's a fairly long, well, a kind of long burn to do our circularization at Gilly, and Gilly's sphere of influence is so small. If you're too far away from the center of gravity of Gilly, the actual time you spend within the sphere of influence of Gilly won't be long enough to do that burn. So make sure you're fairly close to the surface. And then once you've captured, you'll find you just very quickly circularize instantly. Most of that burn is just matching your orbit around Eve to Gilly's orbit, and then the last second will be the actual circularization itself. Because Gilly, look at that. So one puff of the nuclear engine and we're on an almost vertical landing course. Now, I think I said this last week as well, that landing on Gilly is basically the same as docking. You basically point retrograde relative to the surface, kill off all your speeds to pretty much 0 before you touch down, because any faster, you'll just bounce. You can't really. It's for all intents and purposes, it's effectively impossible to properly land on Gilly. The best you can do is just sort of slide. So all we're going to do is just disembark the vessel just above the surface. Valentina would very much like a turn EVAing somewhere, because Jebediah and Bob did the Eve mission. Bill is, of course, afraid of space, so he decided to stay on board. And Val can plant her flag, which, you know, as I mentioned earlier back on Eve, is the most important part of any mission. Oh, and just in time, we've got a nice boop from the, I guess it's now a Gilly lander, that transfer stage. And she can start ascending. And whoa, I guess we can soak in the sight of the newly redesigned Gilly surface. And just like Eve and Duna and Ike and Mun and Minmus, I guess, it's beautiful. It's a phenomenal improvement on what we had before. So kudos to you, squad. I very much hope, well, I very much hope that the other planets in the Kerbal system get a similar sort of treatment, particularly Lathe. So I can do Life on Lathe again. I've delayed Life on Lathe again in case, Squad redesign the surface of Lathe and can make it beautiful like this. I said earlier that kind of Expedition Eve is somewhat ruined now because it was on the old, disgusting rubbish Eve. I don't want the same to become of Life on Lathe 2. So we'll let Lathe get updated. Or, if they're adding Lathe in Kerbal Space Program 2, I might just transfer that series over to the sequel for this game. Who knows? Exciting times lie ahead, guys, but I don't see myself resuming that series in 2019. It's looking like it's going to be a New Year's thing, if at all. Maybe I'll come up with a better series idea by then. I feel like Life on Lathe got a fairly good shot though, right? I did a lot. We built surfaces, we built multiple surface bases, aircraft, SSTOs, space stations. I think we got a pretty good gig. Anyway, there's a little shadow of our ship as we depart from the surface of Gilly and get ready to circularize. Well, I guess we don't even need to circularize. We can just immediately get our way back to Eve orbit and start thinking about getting back to Kerbin. Now, what I was planning on doing, and I said this last episode as well, but again, you may have skipped the build or just skipped last week altogether. I built a lot of Delta V into this stage because I wanted to just get back to Kerbin quick. And you can get back to Kerbin, you can basically force a Kerbin encounter by doing a massive burn to escape Eve and getting a really eccentric re-entry on Kerbin, which will result in a very high re-entry speed, but I know those ablative heat shields are very overpowered. I didn't think re-entry heating would be an issue. However, it was that hitchhiker storage module, the 4-seat one, kept on overheating very, very easily. So I had to forget about that plan and just do a sensible transfer back to Kerbin. I did want to spend some of the Delta V we had, to justify it. So I'm not going to do a very efficient escape from Eve. What you should do to maximize the amount of fuel you save by leaving Eve is you want to lower your periapsis to be closer to Eve's surface, kind of at the 100-kilometer mark, just because the closer you are to the surface of a planet, the more fuel efficient you'll be. And even though it seems, counterproductive spending a few hundred meters per second to lower your orbit around Eve, which, is going the wrong way, you actually save more ultimately by doing your burn close to Eve periapsis. However, like I said, I didn't want to do that. I wanted to justify the amount of Delta V I had on this thing, so I didn't bother and got my Kerbin encounter here. I used the skip orbit button to find myself an appropriate transfer to Kerbin, which is going to be a 3-year wait for our poor Kerbals. Luckily, they've got plenty of board games on board to keep them company. We're going to initiate that time warp now and just let the sights go by. I'm also going to maximize the amount of fuel I waste on this mission, which is a phrase I don't say very often in the context of Kerbal Space. I'm going to try and maximize the amount of fuel I waste by circularizing at Kerbin entirely with the engine rather than aerobraking, which is what this ship has the capability of doing. We may as well. And it does mean we can land on the light side of the planet, I guess, which is a bonus. Because, like I said, these videos will look dark on YouTube. Trying to make them as light as possible is always a plus. And, I thought let's put ourselves in an equatorial orbit, because why not? We're trying to waste Delta V. Let's just do that as well. So, here comes Kerbin. No clouds, unfortunately, because I uninstalled my visual mods. I guess I can put them back now we're off the surface of Eve. So next week, hopefully, I remembered to put them back. There's our capture burn there. And, that's a cool river below us. Look at that. It's great. Now we can actually get a good look at the geology. The geography, even, I should say, of various planets and moons that would normally be obscured by cloud layers. And then I thought, maybe we can try and aim for the Kerbal Space Center. But I could see that we're actually orbiting the wrong direction to what I thought I was, and we were getting pretty close. I couldn't really be bothered to wait for another orbit to happen. I just wanted to get things done. So I just deorbited here and accepted that I was going to overshoot the Kerbal Space Center. I mean, I feel like at this point I've shown the fact that I have the ability to land there if I wanted to. The Kerbals, it's been 4 years, kind of, they just wanted to go home. So that's what I'm doing. I'm just doing that. And I guess it would make sense to land this thing in the sea, given that it doesn't have any landing legs to do a hard landing on land. There we are. Parachutes are all deployed. We can use aero brakes. Going slightly mad by doing this commentary for 30 minutes straight without any brakes. We can use those aero brakes to supplement the slowdown of those parachutes. And now the main ones are deployed. We're coasting down to nice and breezy, 5.6 meters per second. I'm just going to crossfade now to the splashdown itself. I don't need to subject you to watching an entire descent yourself. And there we are, all splashed down on Kerbin with another EVE mission under our belt. So I hope you enjoyed this mission. I'm going to crossfade to a nice, beautiful shot we took back on EVE and allow the end screen to materialize. On the left, we'll just put part 1 of 2 on the left-hand side, and on the right will be a video chosen for you by YouTube's recommendation algorithm. There's also a link to subscribe and check out Patreon if you want to. In the description, you'll find Instagram, Twitter, Discord, merchandise, all that good stuff. Guys, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.